Mideast envoy Steve Witkoff visited Gaza today, along with Netanyahu Lieutenant Ron Dermer, visiting the Netzarim corridor. If we can put up this first element here, scooped by Barak Ravid, as all things Netanyahu seem to be scooped by. He writes, White House envoy Witkoff visited on Wednesday the Netzarim corridor inside the Gaza Strip together with the Israeli Minister for Strategic Affairs, Ron Dermer. This is the first visit by a U.S. government official in Gaza for at least 15 years. So joining us now to discuss this and also a recent reporting trip that he took to Syria is my drop site colleague, Maaz Hussein. Maaz, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And so Witkoff had actually floated this in, I believe it was in a Fox News interview recently, causing complete pandemonium among Israeli political observers and political participants, saying, "What in America?" This, like, they're already panicked about this guy because he, forced Netanyahu to work on Shabbat and then forced him into this deal that is now unfolding. They accuse him of being, basically a puppet of Qatar. When he said he was going to go visit Gaza, they completely lost their minds. Oftentimes, that kind of meltdown would yield a backing off, a retreating from the position. Instead, he ends up going to Netzarim corridor, I think, importantly, with Ron Dermer, who is this guy that, very well known around Washington, used to be Israel's ambassador to Washington. He's a guy from Miami. Netanyahu's probably closest confidant, very smooth operator. So they wanted a babysitter with him as he's going in there. What do you make of Witkoff's willingness to go through with this, kind of in the face of Israeli opposition?
Well, I've been watching very closely the Trump administration's nascent sort of approach to Israel, Palestine, and the Middle East more generally, because of the fact that obviously the Trump coalition contains very different streams of people with different views of foreign policy. And some people are the more neocon type people, you could say, who dominated in the first term. But there's this very strong, you could say, America First nationalist type of contingent as well, too. And they're very skeptical of further deep U.S. military involvements in the Middle East and even Europe to an extent, too. So they would like to extricate themselves from the situation. And, I don't know exactly yet. And obviously, from the first Trump term, I'm cautious and wary of the approach he's going to take. But I do think there's some hints that maybe the latter category is seeing its views represented more strongly. And we saw this with some of the personnel decisions, too, or some of the, not even personnel decisions, some decisions Trump made to kind of sideline the Iran hawk people from his first term in the last few weeks. So Witkoff, he's taking these steps, pushing for the ceasefire, kind of, as he's mentioned, forcing Netanyahu to work on Shabbat. I think Netanyahu is very secular anyways. I think that was a excuse, but he made him do that. And now, the ceasefire, we see people returning north of Gaza. We see Witkoff actually visiting. These are all tentatively good signs, potentially, that Trump will be taking a different path than he did in the first term, at least to some degree, a relative degree, vis-a-vis Israel and Palestine. But also, it seems like a repudiation of what Biden was doing. Biden was giving Netanyahu every single thing he wants. And one very consistent theme with Trump, maybe even more than any particular views he has about foreign policy or the U.S. role in the world, is that he likes to stick it to the Democrats and stick it to his predecessor. So if Biden was giving everything Bibi wants, well, let's make Bibi work on Shabbat. And then maybe we'll force him to end the war. And Trump, if he did have one consistent message, he said he would end the wars. He wasn't very specific always how he'd do that, but he did say that end. So I think he does have a lot of political capital invested. So I would say I'm cautiously monitoring, and there's some glimmers of hope there. And Witkoff's visit to Gaza seems to be another data point in that.
And speaking of Syria and the Netanyahu administration's kind of pressure here, Israel Katz, you may have seen this, visited what they call Mount Hermon recently in the Golan Heights, and said that basically they're not leaving and they're just fortifying it. He went up to this basically ski resort that is in the Golan Heights that is now illegally occupied by Israel, and they're claiming that they're going to keep this territory that they've claimed indefinitely. And so, Maaz, you just got back from Syria. I guess the first question is kind of like, what were your what were your impressions after having not been there for so long? What is the place like on the ground?
Syria was a very nice country to went to. My family used to go on vacation in Syria because it was just like a nice place to go. Today, if you go to Syria, it's like the apocalypse happened there. It's beyond, you see pictures of Gaza, half the country looks like Gaza. It's just completely flattened buildings, rubble, destruction. Even in the quote unquote normal areas, people don't have food. They don't have, their fancy areas. People are selling, Fifth Avenue, if it could be turned into people selling used shoes and things like that. That's kind of the level of economic the devastation that's taking place there. Even the supply chains, like for food and things like that, they've broken down. So people are just doing whatever they can. The level of suffering is just unbelievable. It's a post-apocalyptic, I would say, sort of environment inside Syria. And I mentioned a lot of areas are destroyed. There are whole cities which are destroyed. There are people living in the rubble who have been living there for a very long time with no electricity, no water. Somehow they're still managing to get their kids educated, doing everything they can, even trying to make the best they can situation. But it's just an unbelievably devastating situation. And as long as it's going to take Gaza to rebuild, it's going to take a very, very long time. You have to extrapolate that to a whole country. Maybe 10 times the population of Gaza. That same level of destruction is very, very evident there. And secondly, I'll tell you from the beginning, it was a very strange environment because when I crossed the border from Jordan, I drove over, I was expecting to see the former government people working at the border, maybe with different bosses. Because my understanding, as reading the news, others people, was that the government was not dissolved entirely. They kept personnel there. What I found actually was that the new guys are completely in control. The old government guys are not there, and everything was very informal. They were just guys with assault rifles, and no one was wearing uniforms. And they just kind of waved me through. They were like, welcome. Didn't really ask too many questions, things like that. It was a completely, aberrant situation, and maybe it'll change sometime in a couple of weeks or months. But it's very much in flux, and they have a tremendous task ahead of them to hold the country together if they can, and if they can rebuild the country, even better. But it's not going to be easy.
Well, and this is another immediate test of Donald Trump's foreign policy. And I'm curious, Maz, what you might have picked up on what people there are expecting to see, or maybe aren't sure what to expect to see from the Trump administration. Obviously, his policy, both towards Israel and Syria, we're kind of like reading the tea leaves, trying to figure out what might extrapolate from the first administration and public statements and personnel to what might happen in the near-term future. Did you get a sense of what people are hearing or expecting, or maybe what they're not hearing or not expecting when you were over there?
Yeah, first of all, it's very interesting because it was never the case you could ask people their opinion before. So, having the idea of having a casual conversation, what you think about what's going to happen politically, domestically, abroad, that was a completely new thing for people there because there's so much fear before and people just weren't comfortable doing it. So now you can have those conversations. And I would say, generally speaking, people they're relieved in the short term that, okay, something is changing and, we're a bit freer. We have to pay bribes all the time, just day-to-day life. But, to your point, like what's going to happen now, domestically, internationally, is great unknown. People are very, very concerned. Many people I spoke to were concerned that, well, this could just be a breather before a new war. It could be a breather before, foreign powers, potentially the U.S. among them, may seek to divide the country. They may seek to partition it on ethnic grounds or there's a lot of concern about that. So I think the concern about Trump is one of many concerns people have. And obviously, the U.S. role in the region is often mediated through Israel. So what Israel does is kind of see an extension of what the U.S. is doing because of the fact that obviously Israel is heavily armed by the U.S. and gives political and diplomatic cover. And there's concern. There's concern that maybe they may try to carve off more parts of the country. They may try to arm people inside the country to foment more chaos. People are very, very, very concerned about this. And, for from what I've seen of Trump so far, he doesn't seem like he wants to get deeply involved in nation building or, quote unquote, nation building or having the U.S. deeply invested in Syria or anywhere else in the Middle East for the most part. I believe he announced, or there was a leak, that he may be planning to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria. And U.S. troops in Syria, they play a very particular role. They were there to fight ISIS when ISIS was very, very active, and they're defending some of the Kurdish groups that were helping fight ISIS at that time. And they also keep this very large prison complex called Al-Hol, where tens of thousands of former ISIS members and their families, and also some innocent civilians are incarcerated. So the U.S. may withdraw that presence, and if they do, it'll inevitably create a vacuum where something else happens in there. So either there'll be a resumption of fighting between central government and the Kurdish groups, or maybe ISIS people will revive. These are all open questions right now, but they're things that people are thinking about and concerned about. And as I said, the situation is still very much developing, but what the U.S. does is very much at top of mind for many people.
And something you had mentioned to me I found really interesting, where you said that Assad, of course, has fallen and fled, but elements of his regime are still holding some territory and still fighting, that the war is over in the sense that it's been won by HTS, but yet the war is not actually over yet. And can you talk a little bit about who these elements are that are still fighting? And could you imagine them, let's say the U.S. withdraws, now the Kurds are more vulnerable, could you see the Kurds, allying with some of these kind of gang elements to try to weaken the central government to maintain their own position? Like, what's going on with the fighting?
So by the time the government collapsed, the degradation of the state had been so extensive that you effectively had, gangs. It was basically a gang with no ideology, which was controlling the country, and they were involved in drug trafficking, particularly Captagon, other forced smuggling. They're making a lot of money for themselves. And so the regime left. It was decapitated, you could say. The head of the regime fled to Russia, and many other leaders scattered. We don't know exactly where. But there are all these military units were controlled by officers, and they'd be turned into gangs, basically. They're mafias. And when the government fell, they disappeared. Like, you don't see them in Damascus anymore. And interestingly, in Damascus, there used to be Bashar Assad's photo in every single corner. There's not a single trace of him anymore. So they kind of disappeared from Earth, at least from the major cities. But they've gone to the countryside, they've gone to the coast, and they still maintain, they have their money, they have their cliques around them and so forth. And the government has offered that people can, demobilize certain cases, former soldiers and so forth. They can turn in their weapons and go home. But, a lot of people who are more senior or who were allegedly implicated in crimes during the government, they don't have that option. And some of them don't want to do that either. They have financial interests. But they have power independently in their own right. So, it's kind of like, it's a very Hobbesian situation, you could say, because there is a state now which is trying to assert a monopoly in violence, but the previous state didn't have a monopoly in violence. So you're trying to reimpose order on this very, very big country with lots of guns and lots of money and lots of drugs floating around. Is a pretty significant amount of territory. And I'll tell you that the level of traveling around the country, the level of control that the government has doesn't seem totally clear, because there are not that many of them. There are only maybe couple of tens of thousands of people. They controlled one province, and now they control suddenly the whole country, which I think they were not expecting. What I saw of HTS is mostly 16, 17-year-olds with AK-47s who were just kind of standing around and, guarding stuff or taking pictures and things like that, that they're not seemingly ready to assert control of the entire country. So it's going to take a very long time. And to your point, this creates a very fertile environment for potential subversion or infiltration of the country. Obviously, these former regime elements, they kind of don't have many options left if they were implicated in crimes and things like that. So they may seek to outside patronage. So a country that you could think of as the UAE potentially can get involved, which have done in other countries like Sudan and Libya and so forth. Israel and the US, they could seek to arm certain elements to cause trouble for the governments, to carve out pieces of Syrian territory for themselves. It's a very, very febrile environment. And, I would say everyone wants a piece of Syria, fortunately. And the people have suffered so much, there's been so much destruction. And I would say the vast majority of people of all backgrounds simply just want no more wars. And they want the economy to recover and sanctions to be lifted and to go back to somewhat a semblance of normality. But I think that the geopolitical interests of other countries are so strong that there will be a lot of resistance to that. And you can only hope that whoever's in charge is able to reassert control. But it's going to be, like I said, a very, very difficult path. And, reasserting just physical control is the first step towards that.
Yeah, it would be incredibly difficult to do it if Syria had real borders and was just fighting, among the factions that were within the Syrian borders. But to your point, the instability can be kind of generated and furthered by elements that have a lot of interest in making sure that Syria isn't able to kind of reconstitute itself as a real state. And I get somewhat related to this, I'll point out that so today's Wednesday, tomorrow night, Thursday at 8 p.m. at Dropsite, we're screening a documentary about Syria, and which focuses on American leftists. Like we had one of the Brooklyn hipsters on this program, talking about how he kind of went over and fought with the YPG against ISIS. We'll be screening that documentary at Dropset. I can put a link in there, and Maz will be leading the Q&A with the director afterwards. But hope everybody checks that out. There's an opportunity to catch that for free. Maz, welcome back to the States, and thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys.
Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.